Okay. All right. So I would like to introduce, I'm actually so happy to introduce Malia Rumbaugh, who has expertise that we haven't really had in our series before. So we're very excited about that. She's a genetic counselor with 20 years of research experience in the genetics of neurodegenerative disorders. She earned her MS in genetic counseling from the University of California, Irvine, and currently works at Indiana University in research on the genetics of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. She provides genetic counseling to study participants, is the lead genetic counselor for 2 large multi-site studies of Alzheimer's disease, and co-lead of the asymptomatic subcommittee of the advisory group on risk evidence education for dementia, which was convened by the NIA to focus on communication of dementia risk. She is also part of an NIH-convened work group on biomarker disclosure at Alzheimer's disease research centers. Her recent publications address interpretation of ApoE results in the primary care setting and the impact of new Alzheimer's disease medications on biomarker disclosure. Malia is also co-author of guidelines for genetic testing in Alzheimer's disease, and we're very fortunate to have her here today to talk to us about genetic risk for dementia. Welcome, Malia.
Thank you so much, Barb. I am thrilled to be here. And I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this wonderful series for an invitation to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is working toward a better understanding of how our genes affect our risk of dementia and how to communicate that effectively to our patients. By way of disclosures, oh my goodness, let's get this out of the way first, right? By way of disclosures, my work is generously supported by grants from the Alzheimer's Association, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, the Parkinson's Foundation, and the National Institutes on Aging. Today, we're going to start with a short review of basic genetic concepts, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We will then move on to the genetics of Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and Lewy body dementia. And then we'll talk about some common questions that I get, that probably you get, on the subject of genetics of dementia. Things like, is Alzheimer's disease genetic? My parent had Alzheimer's disease. So does that mean that I will get it myself? Should I get tested for ApoE? And one of my favorites, here's my ApoE results. Can you tell me what this means? I will stop at the end of each of these sections to see if there's any questions coming in on the chat, because I really hope that you'll have questions for me as we go through this. So let's start with a short review of basic genetic concepts. What is a gene? A gene is a segment of DNA. It contains the information we need to construct our bodies and carry out daily functions. We have 2 copies of almost all of our genes, one inherited from our mother and one inherited from our father. So our DNA is packaged into chromosomes, and each of our cells contains a complete set of our genetics. And that's why we can take a blood sample or a cheek swab and test genes that might affect how our nerves work, how our brain functions, and many other aspects of our health. So a gene codes for protein. In this little cartoon, you'll see, a segment here of maybe 3 nucleotides. Genes are actually hundreds or thousands of nucleotides long. And our bodies take that information and turn it into protein. And protein is what carries out most of the function in our bodies, whether that be contracting our muscles or our neurons firing in our brain, or how we build our bones. And if there's a change in this DNA, also called a variant, that can result in a changed protein. Now, there are different types of variants, different types of changes in our DNA. Some of these are benign. They're a natural part of human variation, and they have no known impact on human disease. Some of these are pathogenic, causing disease. These can be fully penetrant or causative. They always cause disease. or they can be a risk variant, meaning they increase the chance that that person would have the disease, but it's not a 100% thing. And there are some people who carry these risk variants who will not develop the disease. This distinction between causative genes and risk factor genes is going to be very important for the genetics of dementia because we see both types. And sometimes we don't have enough data to tell whether a variant is benign or pathogenic, and those get classified as a VUS, or a variant of unknown significance. Now, what happens if we find a new variant and we need to decide if it's gene causing or not? This is a complex process, and one of the steps in that process is to check a database like NOMAD. This is a collection of sequencing data from hundreds or thousands of individuals, and we can search this database to see if the variant is common, and we see it in many people without disease, or maybe it's never been seen before. The organizers of NOMAD, and I have to say this is a fantastic resource, and they try to make the database as diverse as possible, but they do suffer from a common problem in genetics, which is that our data doesn't necessarily represent our diversity. We know that some genetic variants can be risk factors in one population, but benign in another. So if we look at a description of one of the resources available on NOMAD, this is a database of over 120,000 individuals, which is fantastic. But let's say our patient is of Middle Eastern descent or Native American descent. And as you can see, those populations are not well represented in this database. Therefore, we need to be careful about the conclusions we reach when analyzing their data. This is an acknowledged weakness in medical genetics and one that we're working hard to fix, but we're not there yet. Before we move on to the next section, any questions so far?
I don't see any in the chat.
We will keep moving then. And if you out there are ruminating or wondering.
Oh, here, I got one.
Okay.
How does Genome AD get their genetic information? Do companies like 23andMe contribute automatically?
They don't contribute automatically. So 23andMe, so I don't work for 23andMe, but my understanding of the process is that you can decide whether or not you want your genetic data in that database. And if so, it may very well be added into NOMAD. There are also other studies that things like the All of Us study, which is a federally funded study, that add their data into NOMAD. So it comes from a variety of sources, but just like with any genetic research, we do ask people and make sure it's okay.
Sorry, I mispronounced that. Lorraine said no cultural diversity, amazing. Or she said I should say racial diversity. That was amazing.
Yeah, trying. I mean, it's better than it used to be, but it is tough. It is honestly tough. So yeah, working on it. Anything else?
Don't see anything else at this point.
Let's move on. Let's talk about the genetics of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, when you look at it as a whole, about 75% is going to be late onset non-familial. So symptoms begin after the age of 60, 65, depending on your definition, and these individuals do not have a strong family history of the disease. About 20% will be late onset familial, onset after 60, 65, and there is a strong history of the disease in the family. Depending on what study you look at and your definitions, about 5 to 10% of Alzheimer's disease is early onset. and about 1% is genetic onset. And by genetic, I mean one of those causative genes for Alzheimer's disease. Those genes are PSEN1, PSEN2, and APP. They are all involved in the production of amyloid, and amyloid being one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. In this cartoon here, the vertical structure you can see here is the cell membrane. Cytosol is the inside of the cell. Here's the outside of the cell. The amyloid precursor protein, which is the protein coded for by APP, falls across the cell membrane, and it is cleaved or cut by two different enzymes, beta secretase and gamma secretase. And PSEN1 and PSEN2 interact with gamma secretase. And if we have a mutation in one of these genes, that can affect where gamma secretase cleaves this amyloid precursor protein. And that results in different forms of amyloid. And some forms of amyloid are more likely to go and form these amyloid plaques, which are the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. They tend to have different ages of onset, PSEN1 being the earliest. Most sources will say 30s at the earliest. I have to say I knew somebody who had a PSEN1 pathogenic variant and had onset in his 20s. So we can see that, thankfully very rare. And you can see onset into the 70s with PSEN2, or sometimes I know one case of somebody who had a pathogenic variant PSEN2 and did not develop the clinical signs of Alzheimer's disease. That is very rare, unfortunately. This is a typical family tree that we would see in one of these families. Let's say this is our patient, a man, 50 years old, onset of cognitive decline at 48. His father had onset at 42. His paternal aunt had onset at 51, and his grandmother on his father's side had onset at 45. So when we talk about these purely genetic early onset Alzheimer's families, this is the sort of thing that we see. Now, what about the other 99% of Alzheimer's disease that is not purely genetic? Here we enter the realm of risk factor genes, and the best studied and most common of these is ApoE. It's the major lipid and cholesterol carrier in the central nervous system. There are three polymorphisms or forms, flavors, if you will, of ApoE. E2 is associated with a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. E3 we consider average risk of Alzheimer's disease, and that's the most common form. And E4 is associated with a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. And E4 has been linked to all different aspects of Alzheimer's pathology. So it has been linked to neuroinflammation, synaptic dysfunction, mitochondrial or metabolism dysfunction, tau aggregation, which forms those tangles, also a hallmark of Alzheimer's, and amyloid aggregation and reduced clearance. So this is fairly well-studied gene, and it's been linked to a number of different things. How does ApoE affect our risk of dementia? Well, the specific risk for Alzheimer's related to ApoE varies between studies, and you can see different numbers quoted in different sources. But the numbers I'm showing here are compiled by one of the most careful epidemiologists I know, Deborah Blacker at Harvard. And it shows the lifetime risk or age through age 85 for people who might carry 2 copies of the E4 ApoE genotype, have a lifetime risk of between 30 and 55%. So it's definitely higher than the general population, but not everybody who carries an E4 will develop Alzheimer's disease. If you have just one copy of E4, you also have an increased risk, about 20 to 25%. And 3.3, which we considered normal, is about 10 to 15%. Now, there are other genes related to Alzheimer's disease, and I apologize, this is a very busy and complex graph, but I think it captures the complexity of what we know so far about the genetics of Alzheimer's really well. So here on the vertical y-axis, start at the bottom, genes that are associated with a relatively low risk of Alzheimer's disease, and moving up to a near certain chance of developing Alzheimer's. And then here, population frequency, we go from very, very rare at 0% or close to 0% to relatively more common. And up here we can see our old friends APP, PSEN1, PSEN2 being very rare in the population, but having a near certain chance of developing Alzheimer's disease. APOE4/4, relatively rare and a higher chance of getting Alzheimer's. And then we move into some of the more common genes that have a smaller effect on our chance of getting Alzheimer's disease. And there are many, many more genes than this, actually. And here the colors relate to some of the cell functions that are related to these genes, whether it be amyloid metabolism, so APP metabolism, cholesterol, immune response, endocytosis, cytoskeleton. There are researchers working to develop what they call polygenic risk scores, where we can combine all the data from testing these multiple and interacting genes and give somebody more of a accurate, hopefully closer to accurate assessment of their chance of getting Alzheimer's. So not there yet, but we may get there. And before I move on to the genetics of frontotemporal dementia, Barb, any questions at this point?
No questions have come across. Do any of you
That's
have
cool.
questions at this point?
And it's fine if you don't. We can
Feel
go ahead.
free, everyone, to just put your questions as they occur to you for this lecture in the chat box, and I'll track them to the next time we pause for questions.
And I really don't mean to put you on the spot. It's okay if you don't.
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on.
Genetics of frontotemporal dementia. Now, this disorder is less likely to be sporadic than Alzheimer's disease. We saw about 75% of people with Alzheimer's didn't have a strong family history of the disease. For frontotemporal dementia, we're looking at about 40%. Also, about 40% have a positive family history of dementia. So that includes also psychiatric disease and motor symptoms. And it's thought perhaps in this 40%, we're looking at a similar combination of risk factor genes as we saw in Alzheimer's disease. These risk factor genes for frontotemporal dementia are not as well understood as Alzheimer's disease. And then 20% of people who have frontotemporal dementia have a pathogenic variant in a single gene. And those genes are C9orf72, granulin or GRN, and MAPT. Now, each of these are more common in the behavioral variant of FTD versus the semantic variant of FTD. They each have their own flavor. C9orf72 is the most common cause of genetic frontotemporal dementia. It's also the most common cause of ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. And we do see sometimes in families that have a pathogenic mutation or variant in C9orf72, you can see people who have both frontotemporal dementia and ALS. You can see people in the same family who have one or the other. C9orf72 can also look like Alzheimer's disease. And so we do see that as well, where someone will have a family history of Alzheimer's disease. We do the testing and find out it was likely also, it was C9orf72. Granulin and MAPT can cause Parkinsonian features, also progressive supranuclear nuclear palsy, cortical basal degeneration. So we also see that in these families. There are also rare genes for frontotemporal dementia listed here. I will say a lot of these are extremely rare, but they are also fully penetrant for frontotemporal dementia. And you might be wondering, with all of these genes, how do you pick? How do you know which gene to test? And the quick answer is we don't. With current technology, it's often the same price to test multiple genes. And so if you know it's frontotemporal dementia versus Alzheimer's disease, maybe you will just test for the frontotemporal genes. But often, if a patient hasn't had an amyloid scan or any sort of positive verification that it is one disorder versus another, the clinician might just order a dementia panel and include all of the causative genes for dementia. So we'll move on to genetics of Lewy body dementia. I'll say this one, under this one, I'm including both Parkinson's disease dementia, which, as you might know, is the onset of dementia more than 1 year after the start of motor symptoms or Parkinsonian symptoms, and also dementia with Lewy bodies, which is the onset of dementia before or within 1 year of motor symptoms. And the genetics of Lewy body dementia are not well understood, I have to say, but it seems to be midway between Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So genes recently identified for Lewy body dementia include here some of the Parkinson's genes that you see in black, especially GBA, which is one of our more common risk factors for Parkinson's disease, has also a higher chance of dementia associated with it. And so sometimes you can see somebody with Lewy body dementia who has a pathogenic variant in GBA. SNCA, which codes for synuclein, which is the protein that is characteristic for Parkinson's disease. That's the protein that builds up in Lewy bodies. Pathogenic mutations in SNCA are more rare, but they are more likely to also involve cognitive issues and dementia. We also see some of the dementia genes in Lewy body dementia. ApoE, we've already talked about. Granulin and MAPT are actually both tied to frontotemporal dementia, but they also come up in Lewy body dementia. It's a complex system, and I think the best quote I saw in the papers that I've been reading about Lewy body dementia is that the genetic basis of it is not well understood. So I'm not able to give you a nice schematic on how many people have familial versus non-familial and how likely it is to be inherited in the family. I don't think we're quite there yet with Lewy body dementia. I will say that if you know a patient who has Parkinson's dementia or has a family history or has Parkinson's disease, I do happen to know a study that's doing genetic testing for Parkinson's disease. So that's PD gene from the Parkinson's Foundation. You can just Google PD gene Parkinson's Foundation. As no cost genetic testing for Parkinson's, which includes Parkinson's dementia, in case that's helpful. And Barbara, any other questions have come in before we move on?
Yeah, there was a question about whether or not insurance pays for any of these tests. You just
Mm,
mentioned a study that covers the cost. What about insurance covering the cost of any of these?
It varies. For early onset dementia, where doing genetic testing can be diagnostic for a person's symptoms, I've seen insurance cover the testing. For ApoE, because we have these new anti-amyloid therapies, and here I'm talking about people who have been diagnosed with dementia and are considering test or treatment for one of the anti-amyloid therapies. Having an ApoE4 allele or variant increases the chance of side effects from those medications. And so I would expect insurance to cover those costs. In other cases, they don't, and it is highly variable. So I've seen it go both ways. Any other questions, Barb?
There was a question about typing out the PDG contact info, and I'm trying to find it right now.
Mm.
I'm seeing it under Michael J. Fox organization. Would that be right? Oh, somebody else got it before I did. Never mind.
Yep, sorry to put you on the spot with that. It's a full disclosure, I work on that study, and we have had a fantastic response to it, which means there might be some wait lists now, but it is, no cost genetic testing for the 7 most common genes for Parkinson's. So it is a great service that the Parkinson's Foundation is doing, and people can do it remote. They can sign up through the website and be sent a kit, or they can sign up through a site, a local university medical center.
Yeah, the link that Lisa put into the chat box actually does have a join the study, enroll now. So great.
Yep.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, it's a great program. Thank you. Anything else, Barb? We'll say
Not
that's
yet.
a no.
Not
Okay.
yet. Yeah, sorry.
No, not at all. Let's move on to common questions. So one of the most common questions that I get, maybe you get, is Alzheimer's genetic? And this is what I say, that there are rare cases of Alzheimer's disease that are purely genetic. People in those families get Alzheimer's early, like in their 30s or 50s. And there are several people with early onset Alzheimer's disease in the same family. So yes, it does happen. It is rare. Most cases of Alzheimer's disease are caused by a combination of genetic and environmental factors. And I should say, speaking as someone who works in genetics, I consider everything that's not genetic environmental. So here we're talking about hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, sedentary lifestyle, what have you. One way to think about this is that everyone has an Alzheimer's jar. And this same analogy could be used for just about any common disease, cardiovascular disease, what have you. Everyone has an Alzheimer's jar, and this jar can be filled with environmental risk factors that I just described. It can also be filled with genetic risk factors. And some of these, might be ApoE, might be TREM2, might be BIN1, any of those genes that we already looked at. We start with a certain number of genetic risk factors, and over time, we accumulate environmental risk factors, and if our jar fills to the top, we develop Alzheimer's disease. Different people have different combinations of genetic and environmental risk factors. So some people are going to start with a relatively large number of genetic risk factors, and they will accumulate environmental risk factors just like the rest of us, but they don't need to accumulate quite so many before they develop Alzheimer's disease. Other people start with a relatively low number of genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's. But if they accumulate enough environmental risk factors, they will still develop Alzheimer's disease. There are protective factors that can make the jar taller. And those can be social activities, mental activities, physical activity, healthy diet, good sleep habits, all of the things we know that decrease our chance of getting Alzheimer's disease. By doing these, we can sort of add rings to the top of the jar, make the jar taller, and give us more time before we develop Alzheimer's disease. And I find when talking to people, it's helpful to steer the conversation and end on things that they can do and steps that they can take to lower their chance of getting Alzheimer's disease. Here's another question that I get. My parent had Alzheimer's. Does that mean I'll get it too? And I think it's helpful to put that in context. We all have a chance of developing Alzheimer's. It's unfortunately not a rare disease, but it depends on what study you look at. But people who have a parent with Alzheimer's have about a 20% chance of getting it themselves. That's compared to about 10% in the general population. Another way to look at it, 20% chance of getting Alzheimer's is an 80% chance of not getting Alzheimer's. There's not a surefire way to prevent Alzheimer's disease, but you can improve these odds through lifestyle changes. And Barb, maybe I will pause there. Thank you, Barb, for monitoring the chat because I am awful at reading and talking at the same time. But it looks like maybe a couple questions have come in.
Yeah, well, Joanne just mentioned that these visuals are really great for helping to translate some of this information to people. Lorraine is wondering if by environmental factors, are you referring to lifestyles or perhaps pollution and work-related exposures, or maybe all of the above?
All of the above. I have a complete bias in this area, working in genetics. In my worldview, there's genetics and there's everything else. So we should probably find another name for it, but yes, could be medical conditions like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, could be air pollution, I think has been linked to a higher chance, slightly higher chance of getting Alzheimer's. What have you, anything that's not genetic, I would call environmental. Anything
Thanks.
else?
That's it for now.
Cool. Here's a great one. Should I get tested for ApoE? So there are clinical guidelines recommending against ApoE testing for people without memory complaints due to its low predictive value. Many people who carry the bad copy of ApoE, which is E4, do not develop Alzheimer's disease. And about half of those with Alzheimer's disease don't have an E4 allele. So the catchphrase is ApoE is neither necessary nor sufficient to develop Alzheimer's disease. You can get Alzheimer's without having an ApoE4, the bad copy. And if you have an E4, that doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. And so a bunch of us got together and recommended against testing for ApoE in people who do not have memory complaints. That said, in the real world, things happen differently. And you might have seen this in the news last November. The actor Chris Hemsworth learned he carries 2 copies of ApoE4 as a part of a National Geographic docuseries. And it's not clear that he was fully informed before he was tested or that the results were adequately explained. Probably goes without saying, but don't get tested as part of a television show or without carefully considering what the test can and cannot tell you and whether you really want that information. For people who are thinking about getting tested and do not have memory concerns, There is a really helpful website, genetestornot.org. And I'll leave this up for a few minutes so you can write it down if you want. It's an online decision tool to help people decide whether or not they want to get tested. And it asks people to consider, do you have a family history of Alzheimer's disease? Will this genetic testing give you useful information? Is this the right time to get tested, or maybe you should wait on this? And whether the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. Among the important issues discussed on this website is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, which protects against discrimination based on genetic information for health insurance or employment. Important to note that this protection does not cover long-term care insurance or life insurance. And so once you know something, you can't unknow it, and it's better to think things through before getting tested. Another good question. Somebody walks into your clinic and hands you their 23andMe ApoE test results, or maybe they got tested through cardiology or nephrology, which also do ApoE testing. And now they want to know, okay, tell me, what does this mean? And it's a really complex question. It depends on a person's family history. It depends on their age. Depends on whether they're currently having memory concerns. And in order to address or begin to address all of these questions, we wrote a paper. And it's a series of vignettes of different situations when patients come in asking about their ApoE test results. And here are some ideas and some guidance on what to tell them. And I should also say that that table that I included earlier that had the various ApoE genotypes, 3, 3, 4, 4, what have you, and the risk of Alzheimer's disease is included in this paper. So this is a publicly available article through the Journal of Family Practice. If you have any problems finding it, you're welcome to contact me, and I can just shoot you a copy of the paper. And that is actually all I have, unless there are other questions or comments.
What questions might you have, or issues that have come up for you as you've connected with your patient populations or people in the community?
One of the main questions or sort of concerns I get is when we hear the word genetic, we think predestination, right? We think absolutely causative. If it's in your genes, it's in your genes, and you are going to get whatever it is. And the idea of this complex interplay between our genes and our environment and our lifestyle is a little harder for people to get their heads around. That's one of the big issues. Among the people I see for genetic testing, one of the big concerns is, especially if they have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Parkinson's, what are the chances that their kids are going to get it? And almost all of these genes are autosomal dominant, which means that if you carry the gene, the pathogenic variant in this gene, there's a 50-50 chance that each of your children will also carry this same pathogenic variant. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or frontotemporal dementia, depending on whether this is a causative gene. If it is a causative gene, then that means if that individual lives long enough, they will have a very high likelihood of getting the disease. Risk variant, it just means if they inherited pathogenic variants in that gene, they have a higher chance of also developing the disease. So those are the most common issues that I hear about from patients and research participants. What does it mean if I carry a mutation, pathogenic variant in one of these genes? And what does it mean for my kids? So,
A question: what lifestyle changes or environmental changes do you see that are most effective at prolonging onset of symptoms of Alzheimer's or dementia?
the Alzheimer's Association is a fantastic source for that. And I would definitely go to that website. The main thing I talk to people about is the link between heart health and head health, or heart health and brain health. So all of the things we know we're supposed to be doing to protect our heart, we should also has implications for our brain health. So managing any high blood pressure, managing your blood cholesterol levels, managing your blood glucose levels. Exercise is very important. Eating a balanced diet, the standard Mediterranean diet is a very good idea. In addition to all of those things, staying socially active and staying mentally active are great things to do for your brain health. So, yeah, what I tell people is that it's all the boring stuff that we know we're supposed to be doing anyway, and it's hard to do, but it really does have an impact on our health.
Malia, you had on an earlier slide something about mild cognitive impairment. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the relationship between mild cognitive impairment and genetics and development of Alzheimer's. Um, do you deal with that at all, where you're seeing people come with mild cognitive impairment and then wanting genetic testing done, for example?
Yeah, so personally, I don't often see people with mild cognitive impairment because they are not eligible for our Alzheimer's studies, since I do sometimes see people with Parkinson's disease who are beginning to have cognitive issues. In terms of genetic testing for, let's say somebody is concerned about their memory and they want to get ApoE testing to see if it's Alzheimer's or not. That is an option, but it gives you limited information. It's, since again, ApoE testing is not absolutely predictive, and half of people who develop Alzheimer's disease don't have an ApoE3 allele, a 4 allele. What I'll sometimes talk to them about is what might be just as helpful or more helpful is doing baseline cognitive testing and then repeating that a year later to see if there has been decline. And also doing some of those lifestyle interventions in the meantime. So it's a different story, I'll have to say, if it's a family with early onset Alzheimer's disease or early onset dementia. In that case, you may want to think about doing testing for those genes. And in one of those families, it's most helpful to do genetic testing on an individual who has been diagnosed with early onset dementia, to know that you're testing the right person in the family. Because if you say, somebody whose parent and uncle and aunt and grandparents died with early onset dementia, and you do genetic testing on that individual in the next generation who does not currently have cognitive complaints, let's say that testing comes back negative, which is great, but you don't know if you've tested for the right thing. I mean, maybe it's come back negative because there's a gene we haven't found yet in the family. And so we are, in our testing for the currently known genes, we're not going to pick that up, and we may be giving false reassurance to that individual. So general concept in genetics, start with somebody in the family who has the disorder, make sure it's a gene that you can identify in the family, and then you can offer predictive testing to other individuals as appropriate if they want the information. So
I hope you don't mind my asking a couple of questions. Um, um, it seems like a lot of the genes are focusing on the amyloid hypothesis, and yet there's still some controversy about amyloid and Alzheimer's, for example. And I'm wondering if you have some information about how that's playing into the research that's going on right now and what we might see in the future in terms of
yeah,
genetics.
let's flip back. Sorry for all the changes here. Let's flip back to that table, that graph of all of these. So there was, I mean, there's been a huge debate for years, right? Is it tau or is it amyloid? It
Right.
used to be called the Baptists versus the Taoists in Alzheimer's research. And a lot of the genetics is pointing toward amyloid. But there are genes, like we can see here, BIN1, which has the red circle around it, is linked with tau. And it's entirely possible there's other genes linked with tau as well, that in just concentrating on amyloid and not tau at all, we are missing part of the picture. We don't know yet, but I think as we have seen many of these anti-amyloid therapies in the early stages fail and fail and fail, and now we have some anti-amyloid therapies which are somewhat effective. They are not a cure. They hopefully slow down the disease. Yeah, you do wonder if it's an oversimplification to only go after amyloid. So say we don't know at this point, but it certainly seems that amyloid is very important in Alzheimer's disease. Is it the only pathogenic mechanism? No. And is it the only thing we should be targeting in our therapies? Potentially not, but we will see.
So Lorraine mentioned that she thinks that since we don't have treatment or specific improvement, it would be a big conundrum to decide to test or not. She said, I can see this if you're interested in research and helping for the future, you might test. That makes me think about other studies I've been involved with where you really puzzle about what kind of recruitment message you want to convey. And I'm wondering how you do that for the studies that you're involved with.
Yeah, it is really difficult. I would say in our early onset families, our early onset genetic families, where our testing is predictive, more than half of people decide they don't want to be tested because it's not information they can act on. And it's not something they think will make their life better. And one of the exercises we go through in genetic counseling often is to have somebody imagine getting their test results and finding out they do have the family variant, that they do have a strong genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia, and how that sits with them, and whether this is something that they are going to regret learning or not. For some people, the uncertainty is worse than knowing, and they just want to know that if they forget their car keys or they lose their car keys, does that mean it's the start of something or not? And of course, individuals in these families have, even if they don't carry pathogenic mutation in the gene, they have the same risk for late onset Alzheimer's disease as the rest of us. Mm. Many use the information, those who decide to get tested, many use the information to join studies And there's a study called DIAN, Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network, which has done great work in understanding the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, understanding the very early signs of Alzheimer's disease, because in these individuals who carry one of these variants, you can look at the family and make a fairly good prediction of the age at which they will develop symptoms. And so those individuals are carefully followed in the 5 to 10 years before average symptom onset to see what are the changes in, on brain scans, on lumbar punctures, on blood tests. What are the very early signs we can pick up as Alzheimer's starts to develop in the brain, but the person isn't showing symptoms yet? And once we do have very effective therapies, it's going to be really helpful, I think, to be able to identify people in those very early preclinical stages and start the therapies at that point. So that's all the causative genes. ApoE, some people, again, they just want to know whether or not they have it. Frankly, a lot of people, I think, get 23andMe testing, and people I've talked to may not think through it that thoroughly. And then they find out that they do have an ApoE4. And then they're really wondering what it means.
So this is my stupidity, Malia. I've never done 23andMe. What sort of screening or preparation is involved in that? Any?
They do. So 23andMe tests for Parkinson's, and that's part of their standard panel for your health screening. For ApoE, they do ask you to opt in. They do ask you to check a box and say, yes, I want this information. And they tell you a bit about what the information involves. So they do ask people to read through a description about what the test can tell you and what it can't. And I don't think I've seen any numbers from 23andMe on how many they've tested, but it's at least in the thousands. So that is a common way that people find out their ApoE results.
Mm-hmm. So can you please repeat what DIAN stands for?
Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And if a patient joins a study with testing, is this information protected in case, say, they want life insurance or long-term care insurance? So if they join a study and there's testing, is that protected information?
It is. So, well, depends on the site, depends on the hospital. The Mayo Clinic requires that any test done in a research study be added to the clinical record. And so that is something that for our sites at Mayo, both, Rochester and Jacksonville, and they have many sites, that those individuals need to understand, because their research results are not protected and from their clinical record. That's the only site I know of that does that. For everybody else, it is not included in their clinical record. Often clinicians really want it in the clinical record because that's useful information for a person's medical care. And so participants are given the choice whether or not they want it in there. Now, if somebody decides they don't want it in their clinical record and they are asked by long-term care insurance, have you ever gotten genetic testing for this or that, for Alzheimer's disease? They could say no. I don't think there would be a way for that insurance company to find out, but it is insurance fraud. So it is something not to be taken lightly. When we are especially talking about some of these more predictive testing, causative genes for especially Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, for someone who has not developed symptoms of that disorder, We say, are you comfortable with your long-term care insurance? Are you comfortable with your life insurance? That might be something you want to review before getting this testing because it is not protected by federal regulations.
And other than 23andMe, is it likely that anyone getting genetic testing would see a genetic counselor before the testing occurs?
It depends. So if you are seen in a genetics clinic, you're certainly likely to see somebody in a genetic counselor for something like Huntington's disease or some of the genetic forms of other neurological diseases, Charcot-Marie-Tooth or what have you. Especially for predictive testing. Again, if someone doesn't currently have symptoms, they'll probably talk with a genetic counselor. For our Parkinson's studies, people don't meet with a genetic counselor prior to testing. We have a video that goes over the most important issues in genetic testing. It's an issue in healthcare because frankly, there aren't that many genetic counselors, and genetic testing is getting more and more common. And so we're trying to find ways to make sure that people are fully informed about the ramifications of this testing while taking into consideration the availability of people to really sit down one-on-one and go over those issues. So it depends. Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
It's helpful. Any other questions, folks? Well, I, for one, have learned an incredible amount from this. I really appreciate your expertise, Malia,
Oh yeah.
and all the information that you've shared. We're getting comments about it being a wonderful presentation, and
Oh,
just the information, the way you've presented it makes it easier for us to convey to people out in the community. So I appreciate that.
absolutely. And again, if you have any questions in the future, if you'd like a copy of that paper,
Paper.
that's my email address. Shoot me a note. And all right. Oh goodness.
All right.
Oh,
Thanks so much. And everyone, again, this is the last day of the last session for this series. The next one will start up March 28th. You should be getting an email with all of the information for registering. But what a great session to finish up with, because it's there's not a lot of people with your expertise, Malia, and so I really appreciate it. All
yeah,
right.
absolutely.
See everyone in the spring. Hopefully, we'll be done with the rain and the snow by then.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Barb.
Bye bye.